At 2 a.m. on August 9, 1942, the captain of USS Astoria was jolted awake by the deafening roar of shells slamming into his cruiser. 19,000 Marines' beachhead on Guadalcanal depended on the supply ships he was supposed to be guarding. Through smoke and confusion, the captain tried to make sense of it all. Japanese warships. Here. Impossible. They would have had to sail straight past two different battle groups. There were reconnaissance planes everywhere. Someone must have seen something, reported something. He barked at his XO, quote, "Cease firing. I think we're firing on our own ships." Astoria's guns fell silent, but shells still kept coming at them from the darkness. Whoever they were, this phantom fleet was coming straight at them. That was when the silhouette of 8 ships suddenly started to take shape. The gunnery officer and captain looked nervously at each other, both thinking the same thing. What the hell is that? Nocturnal plans. On July 31st, 1942, an armada of 82 ships carrying 19,000 Marines set sail for Guadalcanal under the cover of a fierce storm. The weather shielded them from Japanese eyes, allowing them to slip past enemy radar and into Savo Sound on August 7th, catching the Japanese completely by surprise. A brutal bombardment from sea and sky shattered the calm, and as the first waves of Marines hit the beaches of Guadalcanal and Tulagi, the United States' first major offensive in the Pacific erupted. But the Japanese weren't caught unaware for long. At the Japanese base at Rabaul, a cold chill ran through the Japanese command as the first message arrived from Tulagi, quote, "Enemy task force sighted." Another came shortly after, reporting that enemy landing preparations were underway. Then, at 8:05 a.m., came the final desperate transmission, quote, "Enemy forces overwhelming. We will defend our post to the death, praying for eternal victory." And then, silence. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, a calm but fierce leader, wasted no time. With a battle-hardened mind and the reputation of a man who could turn the tide with a single strike, he quickly devised a plan. His fleet would move swiftly, silently, and precisely under the cover of darkness toward the Allied positions in the Solomon Islands. Mikawa later explained, quote, "My choice of a night action was made because I had no air support on which to rely, and reliable air support was vital to anything but a night action. On the other hand, I had complete confidence in my ships and knew that the Japanese Navy's emphasis on night battle training and practice would ensure our chances of success in such an action, even without air support." Tokyo approved Mikawa's bold assault. At 4:30 p.m. on August 7th, his fleet, 8 ships, including his flagship, Chokai, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a lone destroyer, set off under the cover of the fading sun, their mission clear: strike fast, strike hard, and disappear before the Americans could retaliate. First evasions. The Imperial Japanese Navy strike force moved swiftly southwest from Rabaul, cutting through the night in tight formation. At the center of the column, Vice Admiral Mikawa's flagship, the heavy cruiser Chokai, led the way. The rest of the fleet included the light cruisers Tenryu, Yubari, and the destroyer Unagi. They were joined by 4 heavy cruisers under Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, the Aoba class Aoba and Kinagasa, and the Furutaka class Furutaka and Kako. The sea stretched out before them, black and endless, offering concealment as they advanced. Every man aboard knew they were heading into dangerous waters, but surprise was on their side. Somewhere ahead, beyond the dark horizon, lay the American and Australian fleet, their warships sitting off Guadalcanal, unsuspecting. Mikawa's fleet was underway. Unseen beneath the surface, USS S-38 lurked in the depths, an aging S-class submarine on patrol. Her crew was accustomed to long hours of silence, listening to the sea. Then, the hydrophones picked up something new, a deep, steady thrum, unmistakably the sound of warships moving fast through the St. George Channel. In the dim glow of the control room, the officer on duty studied the readings. This was no lone destroyer or wandering freighter. It was something much larger. Up periscope. A slow, careful scan of the waterline. Shadows emerged against the faint starlight. Multiple ships, close together, moving with purpose. Japanese. Nerves inside the submarine sharpened. Identification had to be certain before any action could be taken. They tracked the formation's bearing, southeast. But whether they were headed south toward the Solomon Islands or simply preparing to maneuver toward their bases at Kavieng or Buka, There was no way to tell for sure. The crew relayed their findings to base. A contact report was sent, noting the direction of movement, but lacking certainty about the destination. There was no urgency in the transmission, just a routine message, another piece of intelligence among many. By the time the Allied command received it, hours had passed. The report's usefulness had already faded. The Imperial Japanese Navy's fleet had moved on, closing the distance to Guadalcanal. The Americans had no idea what was coming. The sea became dark and featureless under the overcast morning sky of August 8th. Then, at 10:25 a.m., Mikawa's entire operation was thrown into jeopardy. A sharp-eyed lookout on Chokai spotted a speck in the sky, moving against the cloud cover. Within moments, the shape resolved into an aircraft, an Allied reconnaissance plane, circling high above the formation. Tension gripped the bridge. Mikawa watched in grim silence as a radio officer rushed to him with an intercepted transmission. The aircraft had already reported their position. The Americans knew. His entire strategy depended on stealth. A daylight sighting meant the enemy had time to react. If the Allies acted quickly, they could launch an airstrike before his force ever reached Guadalcanal. The enemy's carrier-based aircraft could already be lifting off. The Japanese cruisers pressed on, their anti-aircraft gunners standing by, waiting for the inevitable attack. None came. Then, just after 11 a.m., another aircraft appeared. The crew of Chokai watched in growing unease as the second plane lingered, banking over the formation before vanishing toward the horizon. That meant another report had been sent. 2 sightings in less than an hour. The Americans had them marked. Mikawa weighed his options. Turning back meant abandoning the mission, but pressing forward risked being annihilated by an incoming air attack. He made his decision. He slowed the fleet's approach. After nightfall, his ships could vanish into the black waters. The risk of running into an Allied surface force was high, but it was better than being caught in the open by bombers. The fleet altered its course slightly toward the New Georgia Sound, hugging the darkness as the day dragged on. The waiting was agony. Every man knew that in any moment, the sky might erupt with the roar of incoming American aircraft. Yet the sky remained empty. What Mikawa could not have known was that, while the reconnaissance planes had done their job, their reports were vanishing into an Allied communications disaster. Missed chances. The first sighting had come from a Royal Australian Air Force Lockheed Hudson flying out of Milne Bay, New Guinea. At 10:20 a.m., the crew had spotted multiple Japanese warships steaming southeast at speed. The pilot immediately transmitted a sighting report to the Allied radio station at Fall River, New Guinea. No response. The aircraft sent the message again. Silence. Rather than continuing their patrol, they turned back toward Milne Bay, landing at 12:42 p.m. The pilot rushed to deliver the report in person. But inside the intelligence office, the debriefing officer barely reacted. The Hudson's crew knew something was wrong. Their sighting was critical, an entire Japanese strike force on the move. Still, protocol was protocol. The message was passed up the chain of command. First, it was sent to Port Moresby, then forwarded to Townsville, arriving at 2:37 p.m. There, it sat untouched for over 3 hours. The information, which should have been relayed immediately to Allied commanders on Guadalcanal, was stuck in an administrative bottleneck. Finally, at 6:20 p.m., the report was sent to Brisbane, and then relayed to the naval radio station in Canberra. From there, it was forwarded to Pearl Harbor, then finally to the American fleet off Guadalcanal. By the time Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner received it, the time was 6:45 p.m. Over 8 hours had passed since the first sighting. Turner, consumed with organizing the landing operations at Guadalcanal, had no idea that a Japanese attack force was closing in. The second Hudson, tasked with the follow-up patrol, spotted Mikawa's fleet again at 11:10 a.m. Like the first crew, they attempted to transmit their sighting report via radio. Again, nothing got through. The aircraft completed its patrol and returned to Milne Bay at 3 p.m. By then, the first report was stuck in bureaucratic limbo. The second pilot delivered his report in person, but the sighting now seemed redundant. As a result, the second report took an even longer route through the chain of command. It was finally relayed to Turner at 9:30 p.m., 10.5 hours after the sighting. By then, it was too late. He did, however, order a search of the New Georgia Sound, but due to a communication failure, It never happened. Believing the Japanese were focused on building a seaplane base, he failed to raise the alert, assuming an attack was unlikely. His overconfidence in his forces, coupled with a lack of proper threat assessment, left his fleet vulnerable. Meanwhile, Mikawa's force was still moving undetected. The night was coming, and with it, disaster. Blue's blindness. Mikawa believed he had lost surprise, but gained critical intelligence. The Allies were split into two groups. If he struck fast, he could destroy them in detail. At 4 p.m., the Japanese fleet entered the New Georgia Sound, also known as the Slot. The long, narrow passage stretched ahead, dark waters hiding unseen dangers. On board Chokai, anti-aircraft crews stood ready, eyes on the sky. Every shadow on the horizon looked like the outline of a dive bomber. Mikawa had no time to dwell on the uncertainty. His fleet was an improvised force. Most of these ships had never fought together before. A complex battle formation would only create confusion. He kept it simple, a single column straight through the enemy line. Finally, the attack plan went out. Strike the enemy off Guadalcanal, push into Tulagi, then withdraw north of Savo Island. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Japanese fleet cut through the darkness, engines throttled low to minimize their wake. Every man on Chokai's bridge stood tense, scanning the black waters ahead. Then, a lookout stiffened, gripping his binoculars. A shape loomed in the distance, an enemy destroyer. USS Blue, barely visible against the night, was 5 miles ahead. An impossible distance for most, but the Japanese had the best night binoculars in the world, and their crew had received significant night battle training. Mikawa reacted instantly. The fleet slowed, altering course ever so slightly. 50 heavy-caliber guns silently adjusted their aim, locked onto the lone destroyer. If it raised an alarm, it would be obliterated in seconds. But firing now would destroy any chance of surprise. The fleet inched forward, every officer straining to see whether Blue had noticed them. The minutes dragged. Blue continued on its path, seemingly oblivious. The Japanese ships pressed on, slipping past like shadows. The stress was suffocating. Any second, a searchlight could snap on, but nothing came. Blue sailed on unaware. Mikawa dared to believe it. Against all odds, they had passed a submarine, 2 reconnaissance aircraft, and a destroyer without being attacked. The path to the Allied fleet lay open. First salvo south. USS Blue had unknowingly allowed Mikawa to slip past, highlighting a broader issue. The entire Allied picket screen was inadequate. With most destroyers guarding the transports at Guadalcanal and Tulagi, only the destroyers Blue and Ralph Talbot were left to patrol the northwestern approaches. Though these 2 ships had the best radar performance, radar alone wasn't enough. The Americans, still inexperienced with the technology, had come to rely on it, leading to a false sense of security. Worse, an 8-mile gap between their patrol lines created a blind spot large enough for Mikawa's force to pass unnoticed. Meanwhile, Turner commanded 6 cruisers and 4 destroyers guarding the western approaches. On paper, they should have been more than capable of handling an attack. But rather than concentrate their firepower, the fleet was split into 2 groups to cover multiple entrances into the Sound. The southern group, commanded by British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, consisted of the Australian cruisers Australia and Canberra, the American cruiser Chicago, and 2 destroyers, USS Patterson and USS Bagley. The northern group, led by U.S. Captain Frederick L. Reefcoll, included Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, along with 2 more destroyers, USS Helm and USS Wilson. Despite this force, the Allied command structure was in disarray. Admiral Crutchley left for a conference with Turner, handing command to Captain Bode of Chicago, but without informing Captain Reefcoll, who was technically the senior officer. Bode briefly considered leading from the front, but chose to stay back, expecting Crutchley's return. But Crutchley never came back, and no one told Reefcoll he was now in charge. The result was that the overall commander was absent. Bode was leading from the rear, and Reefcoll was unknowingly the senior officer. Scattered and uncoordinated, the Allies were nearly blind to the coming disaster. At 1:33 a.m., Mikawa entered the Savo Sound. Then, a dark shape off the port bow. A wounded destroyer, USS Jarvis, loomed ahead, limping from an air raid the day before, her crew exhausted, her systems barely functioning. By sheer chance, she was on a near-collision course with the Japanese column. Anticipation spiked. If Jarvis spotted them, she could sound the alarm and ruin everything. Guns were trained on her, fingers tightening on triggers. But Mikawa held his fire. Seconds crawled by. Jarvis steamed forward, showing no sign of recognition. Whether from fatigue, battle damage, or sheer bad luck, she failed to react. So Mikawa detached Unagi to shadow Jarvis. But then, ahead, larger shadows materialized, Canberra and Chicago, moving straight into his path. The moment had come. Above the Allied positions, the low hum of aircraft carried over the water. Aboard their ships, American heads turned skyward. Some assumed the planes were friendly, perhaps an Allied patrol. But few recognized the sound of enemy engines. The realization came too late. No warning went out. The trap was about to close. At 1:43 a.m., the American destroyer Patterson, part of the Southern Force, spotted the incoming Japanese column and transmitted a frantic message, quote, "Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbor." But Mikawa had already launched the attack. 4 torpedoes from Chokai were in the water, streaking toward the Allied cruisers. Above, flares boomed in the sky, dropped by unseen aircraft. Their harsh light exposed the Southern Force like fish in a barrel. The Japanese battle line erupted with gunfire. Chokai led the assault, followed by Aoba, Furutaka, and Kako. At just 4,500 yards, their salvos found their first target, Canberra. The Australian cruiser had no time to react. Shells raked her from bow to stern, slamming into her superstructure, turrets, and waterline. The bridge took multiple hits, mortally wounding Captain Frank Getting. Despite the onslaught, Canberra swung hard to starboard, instinctively moving to shield the transports. Her gunners tried to respond, but it was useless. In the space of a few minutes, she took as many as 27 direct hits. Fires broke out across her decks. The final blow struck the engine room, knocking out propulsion and power. She listed heavily to port, burning and lifeless in the water. Meanwhile, Chicago sighted incoming torpedoes. Captain Bode ordered evasive action, but one fired by Kako struck her bow on the starboard side. The damage was minor, but confusion reigned on the bridge. A 6-inch shell then slammed into her foremast, severing communications. Chicago's main battery never fired a shot. Only her secondary guns managed to return fire, scoring a hit on Tenryu and causing minor casualties. Instead of regrouping or warning the Northern Force, Bode turned Chicago westward and steamed out of the battle. His decision effectively abandoned the transports. Worse, it left the Northern Force blind to the attack heading their way. For his failure to broadcast warnings to the north and retreating from battle, Captain Bode would later be officially censured, though he would take his own life rather than face the consequences of his failed command. Unagi, the Japanese destroyer detached earlier, engaged Jarvis in a brief but intense duel. Though heavily damaged, the American destroyer fought back with everything she had. After 5 minutes of sharp exchanges, Unagi broke off, but Jarvis was too battered to intervene elsewhere. Patterson, one of the few Allied ships of the Southern Force still in action, bravely engaged Tenryu and Yubari alone. Her gunners fired repeatedly, but in the chaos, their shots missed. Return fire found its mark. A shell tore into her aft gun mount, forcing her to withdraw. However, she managed to send off a dire warning to the Northern Force. Bagley attempted a last-ditch torpedo attack, but misjudged the timing. Her torpedoes sped harmlessly into the darkness. Then she too turned away. The Southern group had been shattered in 6 minutes. The Northern Force, still unaware, waited in the darkness. Mikawa turned his ships toward them. The IJN turned north. Mikawa's force advanced in 2 groups, quickly encircling the Northern Allied formation. Patterson had sent an urgent warning, but when it arrived, confusion reigned. Vincennes received it, but Reef Call never got the message. Quincy acknowledged it. Astoria never heard it at all. As the Japanese column closed the distance, their searchlights snapped on, illuminating the American cruisers. The Japanese had already locked their guns and torpedo tubes onto their targets. Vincennes signaled frantically at the Japanese fleet, begging them to turn their searchlights off. The captain believed they were facing down their own friendly forces. Aoba and Chokai fired first, taking aim at Astoria. Heavy shells tore into her bow, ripping through her bridge and superstructure. 2 turrets were knocked out instantly. Fires ignited in her hangar, fed by aviation fuel from her float planes. Crewmen rushed to contain the inferno, but the damage was spreading. Quincy swung her broadsides to port, but had no time. Tenryu fired torpedoes from close range. 2 slammed into her hull amidships, 1 just below her main battery. Water poured in. Quincy fired 3 desperate salvos before a 3rd torpedo struck near her aft magazine. The explosion ended her captain's life and most of the bridge crew. Her stern sagged, fires raged unchecked, and she lost propulsion. She was doomed. Vincent brought her main guns to bear, landing a few hits on Chokai, even damaging the enemy's bridge. But the Japanese returned fire with brutal precision. Shells from Kako and Kinugasa slammed into her waterline, rupturing her forward engine room. A torpedo from Furutaka struck her port side, causing massive flooding. Within minutes, she was burning stem to stern. The battle intensified as Astoria's gunners desperately returned fire, but confusion clouded their efforts. The captain, still disoriented after waking up and rushing to the bridge, ordered a ceasefire, unsure if they were firing on friendly ships. Seconds later, he reconsidered, allowing the guns to resume their barrage. But it was too late. Chokai's first salvo was right on target. Successive hits tore into Astoria's bow, ravaged her gun deck, and shredded the bridge. 2 of her turrets were knocked out, leaving her helpless against the assault. A massive explosion erupted in her hangar, where fuel, ammunition, and aviation supplies quickly fueled an uncontrollable fire. Astoria limped forward, smoke pouring from her hull, narrowly avoiding a collision with Quincy, which was under heavy fire. The fire spread, and the cruiser became an unrecognizable wreck. Astoria's forward damage control rooms were abandoned, and the ship slowly succumbed to the fires and flooding. In total, due to indecision and overwhelming enemy fire, Astoria took between 34 and 63 hits. Quincy fought her own battle. Alba's shells hammered her forward, leaving her helpless as new threats emerged on the port side. Quincy swung to starboard, but 2 torpedoes from Tenryu struck her hull, causing catastrophic damage. A barrage of shells followed, knocking out her aft turret and setting her catapult ablaze. Quincy was now a fiery inferno, smoke billowing from every opening. Yet Quincy kept fighting. Her gunners fired off 3 salvos, the last of which hit Chokai's bridge. The explosion nearly claimed Mikawa and his staff. But Quincy had no time to savor the moment. A torpedo struck her starboard side, knocking out propulsion and sealing her fate. Her captain was mortally wounded when another shell hit the bridge. The battle raged on, flames from the burning ships lighting up the night sky so intensely that the Japanese were forced to shut off their searchlights. The infernos on the American ships provided more than enough illumination to guide the fight. At the head of the Northern Fleet, Vincent was hit hard from the outset. 2 torpedoes slammed into her port side, launched by Chokai. She retaliated, firing back and striking Kinugasa, but that was the extent of her offensive. Caught in crossfire from both the eastern and western columns, a barrage of shells pummeled her hull. All her turrets were knocked out, a testament to the Japanese gunners' precision. Then, another torpedo struck her port side, and the hits kept coming, shells ripping into her steam lines, fire mains, and main battery control. Her conning tower was hit, severing all communications. Fires erupted in the hangar, adding fuel to the growing disaster. The ship's steering and electrical systems failed, and Vincent, once a proud flagship, was crippled. In total, up to 74 shells hammered her, leaving her a wreck in the water. Meanwhile, the Northern Group's destroyers remained ineffective. Helm fired a single salvo at the enemy, but otherwise remained silent. Wilson engaged intermittently, but its efforts proved fruitless. No hits were registered. As the Japanese cruisers began to pull away, leaving behind a scene of destruction, the final obstacle for the Japanese force was Ralph Talbot, a Pika-class destroyer. Yubari, Tenryu, and Furutaka closed in, their guns blazing. Ralph Talbot fought back fiercely, but despite her efforts, she couldn't land a hit. 6 times the enemy shell struck home, each blast a gut-wrenching jolt. Yet, in a stroke of luck, Ralph Talbot surged into a nearby rain squall, finding cover for a relieved crew. The downpour swallowed her whole, and the Japanese ships, unable to pursue, reluctantly peeled off, leaving the crippled destroyer to vanish into the storm. At 2:20 a.m., Mikawa ordered his ships to break off the engagement. The Battle of Savo Sound had ended. The what-ifs of war. The battle had been a stunning success, but Mikawa now faced a critical decision: press on and destroy the exposed American transports at the beaches of Guadalcanal and Tulagi, or withdraw to preserve his fleet. For nearly 2 hours, Mikawa weighed his options. On one hand, his fleet was still in decent shape. Over 60% of their gun ammunition and 50% of torpedoes were intact. The enemy screening forces had been wiped out, and the transports were vulnerable. However, the risks were high. Quincy's lucky shot had destroyed vital navigation charts aboard Chokai, and dawn was fast approaching. A strike on the transports would take an hour and a half to execute, meaning they'd be exposed in daylight. Prime time for American carrier-based bombers to strike. Mikawa decided to withdraw. Ironically, the American carrier force had already withdrawn the evening before. Had they remained in place, the outcome of the battle might have been vastly different. On the other hand, if Mikawa had attacked the transports, his fleet could have escaped without threat. Mikawa's choice remains one of the greatest what-ifs of the Guadalcanal campaign. Mikawa and his crew returned to base on August 10th, their victory is still fresh, greeted by a wave of cheers. The weight of their success hung in the air, but their celebration was fleeting. Far below the surface, the Allied submarine USS S-44 silently observed from its patrol near New Ireland. The crew tracked Mikawa's cruiser division as it steamed toward its home port, unaware of the lurking danger. The order was given. 3 of the torpedoes slammed into Kako. The cruiser jolted violently, fire erupting from her sides. Flames quickly spread, and the ship began to list, her hull torn apart. As Kako slowly sank, the weight of the loss was felt deep within the Japanese fleet, a stark reminder of the fleeting nature of victory. The other 3 Japanese cruisers tried to save all the men from Kako, but 71 of her crew went down with the ship. The battle's casualty count was overwhelmingly lopsided, with the Japanese losing only 58 men and suffering damage to 2 heavy cruisers and a light cruiser. The Allies, however, faced devastating losses. 1,077 perished, 4 heavy cruisers sank, 1 damaged, and 2 destroyers hit. This crushing defeat shattered the Allies' confidence, proving the cost of underestimating the Japanese enemy, whom they had long believed inferior. Admiral Turner later reflected on the failure, quote, "The Navy was still obsessed with a strong feeling of technical and mental superiority over the enemy. In spite of ample evidence as to enemy capabilities, most of our officers and men despised the enemy and felt themselves sure victors in all encounters under any circumstances. The net result of all this was a fatal lethargy of mind, which induced a confidence without readiness and a routine acceptance of outworn peacetime standards of conduct. I believe that this psychological factor, as a cause of our defeat, was even more important than the element of surprise."